I rose a moment ago and asked the previous speaker a question about the fact that we had a budget brought in a few weeks ago where the Minister of Finance and on behalf of the government talked about their direction, talked about where they wanted to allocate resources. While they talked about it in terms of a jobs and prosperity budget, we know that they're laying off tens of thousands of workers at a time when they're talking about creating jobs. We know that they have a frontal assault on senior citizens in this country. But lo and behold, when we see Bill C-38, we find that the damage and the destruction that this government is intent on waging in this country is much greater than we would have imagined. The previous speaker talked about how this government has engaged in massive consultation with Canadians, and that Bill C-38 is exactly what Canadians want. You know, I understand that the Finance Committee went out across the country and held pre-budget consultations with Canadians, and never once was it ever suggested to Canadians that this government was going to gut environmental laws in this country. Never once in those consultations, and from any of the consultations that happened in Nova Scotia on behalf of the Minister of Finance, was there ever any discussion about the fact that this government was going to gut the Fisheries Act, that they were going to completely turn it on its head and take away the power to protect fish habitat that existed in the Fisheries Act. Never once did they say anything to Canadians about their intentions of doing that. I'll give them credit. They did give us a bit of a heads up on the OAS. They did give us a bit of an announcement when the Prime Minister was over in Davos drinking some Chablis with his friends over there and talking off the cuff. He said that he's going to transform this country, and he's going to start by ripping dollars out of the pockets of senior citizens in 2023. I don't care if it's in 2012 or it's in 2015 or it's in 2023. It's an attack on seniors in this country. That's what this government has done. And now we see Bill C-38. Bill C-38 goes after the environment, goes after fisheries, it goes after workers, it goes after seniors, it goes after the whole basis of accountability of the Auditor General to ensure that taxpayers' dollars are being properly spent by a whole host of agencies, Mr. Speaker. And the complexity of the changes that are being proposed in this bill boggle the mind, frankly. I had a conversation with a scientist from DFO, retired, was with DFO in the environmental area for over 35 years. When he initially examined the changes that were being proposed, he said, well, they're not too bad, those initial changes to Section 35(1). They strengthened a little bit of this and a little bit of problem with that. But he said, but then what they do is the other shoe drops, where they bring in changes that are going to completely wipe out any of the improvements that they brought in. In fact, completely wipe out the effectiveness of the provisions in the Fisheries Act that deal with the protection of fish habitat. It is, Mr. Speaker, the most damaging part of this whole bill is the attack that is being waged on fishing communities across this country, on the ecosystem, frankly, because fish habitat is about the ecosystem. It's about the interrelatedness of the water and of the land to ensure that we have a variety of species in this country, in this world, that is contributing to the betterment of our society. And some of it may be commercially viable, but that's not the reason why it's protected. It's protected, Mr. Speaker. Habitat is protected because we want to make sure we have a strong and viable ecosystem. Habitat is the water and land necessary for the survival of all species, including fish. Habitat destruction is the most common reason for species decline. And the Fisheries Act, Mr. Speaker, has been essential to protecting fish habitat and the fisheries that they support. Now, I spent the last couple of weeks sitting in on the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. We were hearing witnesses talk to us about the problem with invasive species in the Great Lakes. Now, I'm from the East Coast, and I don't know a whole lot about invasive species in the Great Lakes. I know a lot about the cod moratorium and how that devastated the coastal communities in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador, and PEI, New Brunswick. I also know how crustaceans, how lobsters and scallops and other crustaceans have rebounded to fill the gap that was left there. But I know, what I know is that the fishery is critical to hundreds of thousands of families in this country, to communities, to families, to children, to our very way of being. And what I learned over the past couple of days is just how closely connected our whole system is. We heard, for example, you've heard, Mr. Speaker, other members of this House have heard about the zebra mussel and how it clogged up the bottom of many of the Great Lakes, and how it attached itself to outfalls of power plants and created great deal of problems. There's also the quaog mussel now that's part of that. Well, there's now another invasive species called and I'm going to forget the name of it, but it's a fish, and it eats the mussels. And the combination of the two creates botulism and results in huge fish kills and fish kills of waterfowl. Now, who would have thought? Who would have thought of that connection and that level of chemistry taking place, Mr. Speaker, to affect the Great Lakes? But it's a serious problem. They got problems there with the sea lamprey and others. But what was interesting is what they told us about the science, about ways to prevent these invasive species and the ways to ensure that they can mitigate the effects of the negative effects of those invasive species, to ensure that the return of more commercially viable fisheries. They don't know that setting in. They don't know those things when an invasive species is initially identified, but it takes science, it takes time, it takes dedication of DFO and Minister of Natural Resources in order to come to that conclusion. But my point is that the changes that are being proposed by this government, simply as they relate to the Fisheries Act and the definition with respect to the protection of fish habitat, is destructive beyond belief, and we can't allow that to happen. And for the government to be so gutless to hide behind this omnibus bill, to not bring about these changes in a bill, have it go before the legislative committee in order for us to bring experts and to deal with the issue, is absolutely wrong. It's fundamentally wrong, Mr. Speaker, and I'm talking to Canadians, as are my colleagues, and they are waking up to what this government is doing, and we are going to stand here in this House and do everything we can, both here and in our communities, to make sure that Canadians understand what this government is intending for the fisheries, for the environment, and for our society, and we're going to do everything we can, along with lots of Canadians, to make sure that this doesn't happen.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Vegreville, Wainwright.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the member across for his presentation, Mr. Speaker, although I have to say I was somewhat surprised by many of the things he said. Many of the members over there have been complaining that there's not enough time to speak on this bill, Mr. Speaker, when the reality is the member from Burnaby New Westminster took 11 hours on this bill. 11 hours. That would give 44 of their speakers time to speak on a bill. But they're complaining, not enough time. Well, it doesn't wash. It simply doesn't wash, Mr. Speaker. Then they're saying that they didn't know about things in the budget, didn't know about things like OAS. Well, this member had to acknowledge that, in fact, he did. Said, well, he didn't know about the changes to the regulatory system, Mr. Speaker. Well, he's not paying any attention then, because we've talked about the need for that in this House. At our committee, I chair the Natural Resources Committee. They have members on the Natural Resources Committee. We hear again and again and again and again about the need for streamlining the regulatory system. We've done it in a way that protects the environment better, Mr. Speaker, because everybody involved puts their information into the one stream, so a better environmental impact study, but done in less time. So why is the member complaining about these things? Let's look at this from a realistic point of view.
The honourable member for Dartmouth, Cole Harbour.
Let me say this. They are gutting environmental regulations in order to allow for the development of natural resources, in most cases oil, unfettered. And let me tell you something. Tomorrow is the 20th anniversary of the West Ray mine disaster that happened. 26 miners died there simply because the government of the day was not paying attention to their own rules and regulations and was not ensuring that the enforcement happened and that those workers were being protected. That's what's happened when you don't pay attention to your own rules and when you water them down to the point where they have no effect, Mr. Speaker, and this government better start recognizing that.
Questions and comments?